The leafy branches of the elm tree swayed in the September breeze as Hauptmann Wilhelm Müller hesitantly approached the wooden building marked Schulhaus at Camp Blanding, Florida. The former Luftwaffe pilot's calloused hands trembled slightly as he reached for the door handle. Behind him, fellow prisoners watched with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. It was September 1944, and for men who had spent years believing education meant Nazi indoctrination, the sight of an American-style classroom inside a prisoner of war camp represented something far more shocking than military defeat. They were witnessing their first encounter with democratic education, a glimpse into a world where thinking for oneself wasn't just permitted, but encouraged. Müller, who had been shot down over Sicily after bombing runs against Allied shipping, had expected torture, starvation, or at best, years of hard labor when captured. What he hadn't expected was to find himself standing before a chalkboard covered with lesson plans for English, American history, and something called civics. The cultural shock was so profound that many prisoners initially refused to attend classes, convinced they were part of elaborate brainwashing schemes. Some even whispered that the Americans were trying to turn them into traitors. But this story isn't just about textbooks and classrooms. It's about a collision between two educational philosophies, one built on obedience, racial doctrine, and the glorification of the state, the other on critical thinking, individual worth, and democratic participation. When German prisoners of war encountered American education programs during World War II, they weren't just experiencing schooling. They were getting their first taste of intellectual freedom that would eventually help reshape their homeland and challenge everything they thought they knew about learning, thinking, and what it meant to be an educated person. The year was 1943, and the war in Europe was reaching a crucial turning point. More than 150,000 men arrived after the surrender of General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps in April 1943, followed by an average of 20,000 new POWs a month. For Germany, the conflict represented a desperate struggle for what they saw as racial survival and living space. The Nazi educational system had spent a decade preparing young Germans for this moment, filling their minds with theories of racial superiority, the glory of warfare, and unquestioning loyalty to the Führer. This wasn't mere propaganda. It was a comprehensive worldview that had replaced traditional education with military drill, replaced literature with racial theory, and replaced critical thinking with blind obedience. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America was not only mobilizing its industrial might, but also grappling with an unprecedented challenge. When the war was over, there were 425,000 enemy prisoners in 511 main and branch camps throughout the United States. The American military, guided by the Geneva Convention and its own democratic principles, saw an opportunity in this massive influx of prisoners. If these men were going to be held for years, why not use that time productively? Why not show them what they had been fighting against? But perhaps most remarkably, the American approach to POW education would revolutionize not just how prisoners were treated, but how an entire generation of Germans would think about knowledge, authority, and their own capacity for independent thought. The contrast in educational philosophies couldn't have been more stark. German soldiers had been products of an educational system that, since 1933, had been systematically Nazified. Teachers who refused to join the Nazi Party had been purged. Jewish educators had been expelled. Textbooks had been rewritten to include racial science and military glory. Physical education had replaced academic subjects. The Hitler Youth had turned after-school time into paramilitary training. Students learned to recite Nazi slogans before they learned to analyze critically. They studied racial charts before they studied literature. They practiced marching before they practiced mathematics. The transformation of German education under the Nazis had been swift and thorough. By 1936, 97% of all teachers belonged to the National Socialist Teachers League. New subjects like racial science became mandatory while traditional humanities were gutted. History was rewritten to glorify Germanic peoples and justify conquest. Literature classes focused on Nordic myths and war poetry. Science emphasized racial biology and military applications. Even mathematics problems involved calculating bombing trajectories and counting inferior peoples. American education, by contrast, even in its imperfect wartime state, emphasized something radically different. Despite its own struggles with segregation and inequality, the American system fundamentally believed in the capacity of individuals to think, learn, and improve themselves. Every camp had an impressive selection of POW-taught courses, ranging from English to engineering, a POW orchestra, a theater group, a camp newspaper, and a soccer team. When American educators looked at German POWs, they didn't see irredeemable enemies. They saw potential students who had been denied the opportunity for real education. The genesis of the American educational program for German POWs emerged from a complex mix of idealism and pragmatism. In early 1943, as the camps began filling with Afrika Korps veterans, American officials noticed disturbing patterns. Nazi hardliners were establishing control through intimidation and violence. Anti-Nazi prisoners were being threatened, beaten, and in some cases murdered. The camps were becoming miniature Nazi states within American borders, complete with kangaroo courts and political terror. The situation caught the attention of concerned educators, journalists, and eventually First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Dorothy Thompson, the prominent columnist, wrote scathing articles about allowing Nazi ideology to flourish unchecked on American soil. "We are feeding and housing hundreds of thousands of young Germans who still worship Hitler," she warned. "Unless we offer them an alternative to Nazi thinking, we will send them home as time bombs, ready to explode into the next war." The public pressure mounted through 1943 and early 1944. Churches, civic organizations, and educational institutions called for action. The Harvard branch of the American Defense Organization submitted detailed proposals to Secretary of War Henry Stimson. The Sager Committee, headed by former German Reichstag member Gerhard Sager, argued that 25% of German POWs were committed Nazis, but the remainder could be influenced through proper education. Initially, the War Department resisted. The Provost Marshal General Alan Gullion dismissed re-education as futile, arguing that enemy prisoners of war are, for the most part, not children. Those who have sufficient intellectual capacity to be of value to a post-war world have already built the philosophical frameworks of their respective lives. Secretary of War Stimson publicly rejected pleas for re-education, stating that prisoners would resist unwelcome teaching. But behind the scenes, pressure from Eleanor Roosevelt and growing evidence of Nazi violence in the camps was forcing a reconsideration. By March 1944, with a new Provost Marshal General, Archer L. Lurch, the decision was made to act. The Special Projects Division faced the daunting task of trying to denazify and re-educate some 380,000 German POWs housed in several hundred camps across the country. The program that emerged would be one of the most ambitious educational experiments in history. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Davison was appointed Chief of the Special Projects Division. Born in Scotland and moving to America as a child, he became one of the most gifted English-language poets of his day and a professor at the University of Colorado. Davison was an unusual choice for such a military operation. He spoke no German, had no background in German culture, and his expertise lay in English literature rather than political indoctrination. Yet this apparent weakness became a strength. Davison understood that heavy-handed propaganda would fail. Instead, he envisioned a program based on exposure to ideas and genuine education. Davison assembled a remarkable team. His staff included Howard Mumford Jones, the distinguished Harvard Dean and President of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Henry Ehrman, a German exile and political scientist who had escaped from a concentration camp, Walter Schoenstedt, a German novelist who fled Nazi Germany, Dr. William G. Moulton, a renowned linguist from Cornell, Robert Kunzig, a young Pennsylvania lawyer with experience working with German POWs, and Colonel T.V. Smith, a philosopher and former congressman from Illinois. The challenge was immense. How do you educate men who have been taught that thinking is treason? How do you introduce democratic concepts to those who believe democracy is racial weakness? How do you convince soldiers who have burned books to read them? Davison and his team decided the answer lay not in telling prisoners what to think, but in teaching them how to think. This distinction would prove crucial to the program's approach. The first major wave of German prisoners began arriving in American camps in late 1943. These were not broken, demoralized men, but elite troops who had conquered much of Europe. They arrived with their Nazi worldview intact, their belief in German superiority unshaken, and their contempt for American democracy profound. Many expected to find a nation weakened by racial mixing and democratic softness. Instead, they encountered something that would shake their ideological foundations: schools. The initial resistance was fierce. Nazi hardliners used violence and intimidation to maintain control. At Camp Hearn, Texas, mysterious suicides claimed the lives of prisoners who showed interest in American programs. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, anti-Nazi prisoners were beaten for attending English classes. At Camp Concordia, Kansas, Nazi thugs posted guards outside the camp church. They warned that anyone who entered would face retribution when they returned to Germany. The reign of terror might have continued indefinitely without decisive action. Dedicated Nazis organized the camp, mobbing those expressing anti-Nazi sentiments. Initially, violent episodes occurred as 50 of the first prisoners were Nazi leaders, so the army transferred 44 out. At least 2 reported cases of executions are recorded. Both were made by prisoners on fellow prisoners, some of whom were Gestapo agents. When conclusive evidence arose, the offenders were tried and sentenced to the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth. This segregation of the most fanatical Nazis to the special camp at Alva, Oklahoma, proved crucial in creating space for educational programs to flourish. But removing the ringleaders was only the first step. The Special Projects Division needed to create programs that would appeal to the remaining prisoners while avoiding the appearance of crude propaganda. The solution came through Article 17 of the Geneva Convention, which encouraged intellectual diversions for prisoners. Davison and his assistant, Major McKnight, were hesitant to push for re-education, fearing retaliation against American POWs held in Germany. But they realized that offering educational opportunities under the guise of intellectual diversion could achieve their goals while maintaining plausible deniability. By late 1944, an extensive educational infrastructure had developed across the POW camp system. The programs began modestly: English classes, current events discussions, vocational training. But they quickly expanded into something far more comprehensive. They created a partnership with the University of Kansas. Even the German Reich's Ministry of Education approved the university concept, and 15 German and Austrian universities agreed to honor any courses. The breadth of offerings was staggering. The curriculum taught at Concordia included approximately 300 subjects, including English, 12 additional languages, electronics, theology, history, geography, government, engineering, medicine, arts, sciences, and vocational subjects. This wasn't just basic literacy or propaganda sessions. German POWs could study advanced mathematics, take correspondence courses from American universities, learn new trades, study languages, and even earn credits that would be recognized by German universities after the war. Camp Concordia became a particularly remarkable example of what was possible. Captain Karl C. Teufel arrived at Camp Concordia as designated assistant to find that the German POWs had already self-initiated post-secondary school, and that anti-Nazis were highly educated, lawyers, teachers, ministers, teaching about 300 subjects. The prisoners had essentially created their own university before the American program even began. The transformation of individual prisoners through these programs provides compelling evidence of their impact. Many prisoners discovered books that had been banned in Nazi Germany for the first time. Particularly in demand among POWs were Exilliteratur by anti-Nazi refugee writers such as Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, Thomas Mann's Zauberberg, and Franz Werfel's The Song of Bernadette. In an article for Intercamp journal Der Ruf, German POW Kurt Vinz opined, "Had we only had the opportunity to read these books before, our introduction to life, to war, and the expanse of politics would have been different." The American approach to education in the camps reflected a fundamentally different philosophy about human potential. Where Nazi education had emphasized conformity, American programs encouraged questioning. Where German schools had taught racial superiority, American classes taught cultural understanding. Where the Hitler Youth had demanded obedience, American instructors encouraged debate. The educational programs served multiple purposes beyond simple instruction. For American authorities, they were a way to keep prisoners occupied and productive. For anti-Nazi prisoners, they offered refuge from the threatening atmosphere that Nazi hardliners tried to maintain. For intellectuals and professionals among the prisoners, they provided mental stimulation and hope for the future. But most importantly, they offered a glimpse into a different way of organizing knowledge and society. A crucial turning point came with the establishment of the factory at Fort Kearney, Rhode Island. On October 31, 1944, the factory began operating at a former civilian conservation camp in Van Etten, New York, which had been converted to a German POW camp, replete with barbed wire, towers, armed guards, and strict rules. The factory was later moved to Fort Kearney and became the intellectual heart of the re-education program. Here, carefully selected anti-Nazi German intellectuals, writers, and educators worked alongside American professors to create educational materials for their fellow prisoners. Davison and his staff brought a humanist perspective to their task, intending to educate through rational persuasion rather than psychological manipulation. This approach would later be criticized by some as too intellectual, but it reflected Davison's belief in the power of ideas. The men selected for the factory represented some of the finest minds among the German prisoners. They worked on their main task, publishing the German-language newspaper Der Ruf. Prisoners who worked on Der Ruf and later joined Group 47 included Hans Werner Richter, a novelist who eventually earned worldwide fame for his role in starting the Group 47. Dr. Gustav R. Hocker, Der Ruf's first editor-in-chief. He was a prize-winning novelist and newspaper correspondent who had been forced to serve as a civilian interpreter for the German army. Alfred Andersch, who had spent time in Dachau before being forced into the army, became another key figure. The atmosphere at Fort Kearney was unlike any other POW facility. These carefully vetted prisoners enjoyed remarkable freedom. They traveled to nearby towns for supplies, attended lectures, held discussions that lasted long into the night, and worked with American intellectuals as colleagues rather than captives. The Kearney spirit, as it became known, represented a unique experiment in international intellectual cooperation during wartime. Der Ruf became the centerpiece of the re-education effort. Unlike crude propaganda, it was a sophisticated publication that addressed German prisoners as thinking adults. The newspaper covered everything from American literature to democratic theory, from German history to practical skills for post-war life. Its first issue appeared on March 1, 1945, with a circulation of 11,000 that would grow to 75,000 by year's end. The impact of Der Ruf extended far beyond its readership. In March 1945, they found that approximately 75% of POW newspapers they examined were pro-Nazi in some form. By that fall, the Nazi editors at other papers had been replaced, and a change of outlook had occurred. This change of outlook was attributed to the combined effects of re-education efforts including Der Ruf, the realization that the war was lost, and prisoner interactions with Americans. Out of 80 papers examined, only one remained pro-Nazi. Beyond Der Ruf, the factory prisoners engaged in massive translation projects. They selected and translated banned German books for distribution to camps. They reviewed films, radio programs, and theatrical productions. They created the Bücherei Neue Welt, New World Library series, 24 volumes of works by authors banned by the Nazis. These included not just German exiles like Thomas Mann and Franz Werfel, but also American authors like Ernest Hemingway, whose For Whom the Bell Tolls was translated into German for the first time. As the educational programs expanded throughout 1945, they began to transform the atmosphere of the camps. Libraries that had once hidden Nazi propaganda now displayed works by Jewish authors, democratic theorists, and critics of totalitarianism. Drama clubs performed plays by Bertolt Brecht and other banned playwrights. Orchestras played music by Mendelssohn and other Jewish composers. Discussion groups debated everything from the causes of war to plans for reconstruction. The Fort Getty and Fort Wetherill programs in Rhode Island represented the pinnacle of the re-education effort. The select POWs entered into a curriculum focused on English as a second language, military government, and democracy. These classes were supplemented by informal discussion groups, visiting lecturers, quizzes, and exams. Fort Getty's first classes began on July 19, 1945, with the 60-day curriculum again focusing on the English language, German history, American history, and military government. Dr. Walter Hallstein, who would later become the first president of the European Commission, was among Fort Getty's most distinguished students. He later wrote, "The atmosphere in the Stalag between the inmates, the teachers, and the staff was terrific." This enthusiasm was shared by many participants who saw in the program hope for Germany's democratic future. The teaching methods employed revolutionized the prisoners' understanding of education itself. Professor Howard Mumford Jones brought decades of educational expertise to the program. He understood that lectures alone wouldn't transform minds shaped by totalitarian education. Instead, the programs emphasized discussion, debate, and critical analysis. Students were encouraged to challenge ideas, express disagreement, and think independently. Lieutenant Colonel T.V. Smith, the philosopher-congressman who taught in the program, captured a revealing moment. "I stood there, an autumn evening at sunset, behind the barbed wire of a German prisoner of war compound, looking at a dozen POWs as they themselves in silence watched the sun go down across Narragansett Bay. Not a word was spoken. The dozen German prisoners stood in single file upon Fort Getty's high bank of the bay with their hands behind their backs, stood so long and so eloquently that at last I walked away, without my reverence at the scene having been so much as remarked by them." The courses covered an extraordinary range. Beyond core subjects, prisoners studied economics, literature, science, agriculture, and vocational skills. Some prisoners even took correspondence courses through local colleges and universities, and their academic credits were accepted by the Germans upon their return. This acceptance by German universities gave the prisoners' American education real value for their futures. Agricultural programs proved particularly popular and practical. Many prisoners came from farming backgrounds and would return to rural communities devastated by war. They learned American techniques emphasizing efficiency and scientific methods. Programs covered crop rotation, soil conservation, mechanization, and livestock management, knowledge desperately needed for rebuilding. Vocational training programs taught skills for reconstruction, construction, electrical work, plumbing, automotive repair, and manufacturing. But beyond technical skills, prisoners learned American approaches to work, emphasizing efficiency, innovation, and individual initiative rather than blind obedience to authority. As 1945 progressed and Germany's defeat became inevitable, the educational programs took on new urgency. Prisoners who had initially attended classes out of boredom now saw them as essential preparation. They would return to a destroyed nation needing rebuilding from the ground up. The skills, knowledge, and democratic values they were learning would prove crucial. The transformation wasn't always smooth. Many prisoners struggled with cognitive dissonance between Nazi indoctrination and new ideas. Some experienced genuine psychological crises as worldviews crumbled. American instructors served not just as teachers, but as counselors, helping students navigate difficult ideological transformations. The revelation of concentration camp atrocities created particularly challenging moments. As newsreels and photographs reached POW camps, many prisoners initially refused to believe them, dismissing reports as Allied propaganda. Educational programs addressed this denial carefully but firmly, using documentary evidence to break through years of propaganda. Some prisoners who learned the truth experienced profound shame and psychological distress. If the end of the war in Europe ended the need for secrecy, it had other ramifications for the re-education program. Canteen privileges in the camps were cut back, and the quantity and quality of the daily diet reduced. POWs perceived the changes as a form of reprisal now that the United States did not have to worry about its own prisoners in Germany, and enthusiasm for re-education tended to wane. Despite these challenges, the programs persisted and intensified. Starting on January 6, 1946, some 22,000 POWs attended the rapid six-day program at Fort Eustis before being returned to Germany. This massive undertaking represented the final push to prepare prisoners for roles in rebuilding Germany. The course at Fort Eustis was broken down into 12 topics covering democratic governance and practical administration. As repatriation began, the true test would come. Would democratic values taught in American classrooms survive return to devastated Germany? Would former POWs maintain new perspectives when facing harsh realities of occupation and reconstruction? Early signs proved promising as many returned as changed men. One of them later noted in jest, "Long was the hair that flowed over the desks of the Special Projects Division." This observation captured something important about the program's character. Unlike rigid military approaches expected, the Special Projects Division embraced intellectual freedom and creative thinking, contrasting sharply with Nazi regimentation. Werner Richter and Alfred Andersch, who had worked on Der Ruf at Fort Kearney, co-founded Group 47 after the war. This literary circle became the most influential in post-war Germany, promoting democratic values, free expression, and critical examination of the Nazi past. Many members were former POWs who discovered intellectual freedom in American camps. Dr. Walter Hallstein became a key architect of European integration. His POW camp experience taught him that former enemies could become partners, that cooperation could replace conflict, and that democratic institutions could unite diverse peoples. His vision helped shape the European Union. Franz Kramer of Gundelfingen, Germany, represented thousands of ordinary prisoners transformed by their experience. He said, "There was no reason to criticize American authorities. The prisoners felt that they were well treated. We learned a little of the American way of life and saw part of the vast country." Kramer made multiple return visits to Kansas after the war, maintaining friendships with farming families who had employed him. The ripple effects extended throughout German society. Teachers introduced American pedagogical methods emphasizing discussion over memorization. Farmers applied scientific techniques learned in camps. Workers helped build democratic unions based on models studied in America. Businessmen adopted American management practices emphasizing efficiency and innovation. In 1946, Lieutenant Colonel Davison received the Legion of Merit for his work heading the Prisoner of War Special Projects Division. His files at Yale University indicate that he valued most his work with the factory at Fort Kearney. This recognition only hints at the program's true impact. Davison and his team had accomplished something unprecedented, using education to help transform enemies into potential allies for democracy. The program faced criticism even as it succeeded. Critics argued Der Ruf was too intellectual, appealing only to educated elites. Many questioned whether re-education truly changed hearts and minds, or simply provided convenient cover for former Nazis. Some pointed out that Germany's complete defeat and occupation probably influenced post-war attitudes more than any educational program. These criticisms contained truth. Many prisoners of war remained unchanged by re-education efforts. Others participated cynically, seeing cooperation as a path to better treatment or early release. The sophisticated intellectual approach of Der Ruf and university-level courses bypassed many ordinary soldiers who might have benefited from simpler programs. Yet the program's influence proved undeniable. Thousands of former POWs returned to Germany with new skills, perspectives, and connections to American ideas. They brought back more than knowledge. They carried experiences of being treated with dignity, of intellectual freedom, of education as liberation rather than indoctrination. In occupied Germany, where denazification often felt punitive, these men offered a more positive vision of democratic transformation. The contrast with Soviet treatment of German POWs couldn't be starker. While Americans offered education and dignity, Soviet camps meant starvation, forced labor, and death for over 1 million German prisoners. POWs returning from America spoke of libraries and lectures. Those from Siberia, if they returned at all, spoke of horror. This difference profoundly shaped German attitudes during the Cold War division. About 860 German POWs remain buried in 43 sites across the United States, with their graves often tended by local German women's clubs. These graves serve as quiet reminders of a remarkable chapter when America chose to treat enemies as potential students, when education triumphed over revenge, when the power of ideas proved stronger than barbed wire. The legacy extends far beyond individual transformations. The POW education programs demonstrated that democratic values could be taught but not imposed, that education proved more powerful than propaganda, that even indoctrinated minds could open to new possibilities. In an age when authoritarianism again threatens democratic societies, these lessons remain urgently relevant. One POW author wrote that the secret re-education camps were probably unique in human history. He wrote that, voluntarily, German prisoners of war have undertaken to start a work of positive aid to their own fellows here in captivity. They did it, he wrote, as men who believe in the future of their home country, a country that must become a part of a peaceful world. This vision, born in makeshift classrooms throughout America, helped shape the democratic Germany emerging from the Third Reich's ruins. The American experiment in POW education proved that the most powerful weapon against totalitarianism wasn't military might, but teaching people to think independently. In converting enemies through education rather than coercion, America won a victory more lasting than any battlefield triumph. The schools that German POWs couldn't believe existed planted seeds blooming for generations. Every German student who learned to question rather than obey, every citizen who voted rather than marched, every intellectual who wrote freely rather than fearfully, owed something to those improbable classrooms in American POW camps. The transformation from Nazi soldiers to democratic citizens began not with defeat, but with education, not with humiliation, but with hope, not with propaganda, but with the revolutionary idea that every human being possessed the capacity to learn, grow, and choose their own path. The German prisoners who experienced American education behind barbed wire learned more than English or civics. They discovered they could transcend what their leaders had told them, think beyond what ideology had permitted, and build something better than what hatred had destroyed. In that transformation lies a timeless lesson, that genuine education opening minds rather than closing them remains humanity's best hope for progress, peace, and the preservation of human dignity. When democracy faces new threats and education itself comes under assault from authoritarian forces worldwide, the story of German POWs discovering intellectual freedom in American camps offers both inspiration and instruction, reminding us that the classroom can be a battlefield where free societies' futures are determined, one liberated mind at a time.